following program is classified G. It's suitable for all ages.
Tonight, are we providing a voice for the voiceless? Has Sri Lanka done enough to protect the animals within its borders? However, when speaking of the rights of animals, one must be aware of the large number of industries attached to the domestication of animals. A requirement to balance the use of nature with the needs of the world has sprung up. Is the law doing enough to cater to this requirement? Welcome to Law, Land and Liberty. As usual, we are keeping with the promise of bringing it a contemporary legal topic and breaking it down in the midst of a guest who is a professional in that specific field. And today we selected the topic of animal rights, a topic that has been within the discussion platforms within our country for quite some time. And we really need to get to the bottom of this as a country, how we really address the issues of the voiceless. And it really speaks about how we as a nation, the moral compass of our nation really functions. So a lot of questions that I need to clarify, and we have a very good individual to give us that explanation. Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake, he's the convener, consultant for the Criminal Law Reform Subcommittee in the Ministry of Justice. He has also worked with providing amendments to the current legislature on animal rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Sanjith.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
All right. Before we move ahead, I want to give our viewers a general breakdown as to how we will be doing this discussion. We are going to firstly talk about the provisions for animal welfare within this country, talk about the local provisions and get a head start there. Then move into how animals are used within the agricultural industry within this country. Next, we are going to talk about the international protective mechanisms and whether we are party to certain mechanisms that we have to abide by as a country. And finally, the much spoken of animal welfare bill. We'll get to the bottom of that and get really the discussion started as to where we are heading with the animal welfare bill.
Hi, my name is Mandrija Sekhura. I'm a technical designer and an animal activist. My question is, what are the legal provisions and laws to protect abused animals in this country, specifically pet-owned dogs and cats, and also our community dogs and cats, and if these laws provide adequate protection for our animals?
All right, let's move into our first segment, and that is going to be generally on the provisions for animal welfare. Now, a number of points of discussion that have come up pertaining to this, and something that we most recently saw was the Gazette notification pertaining to the people that work with and around elephants, and whether drivers are given a certain amount of technical restrictions. And we really need to get our take on that, exactly what the present legislature is and how we are going to move forward. Before we get into all of that, Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake, I want to give you a place to start the entire discussion pertaining to how we will be going forward. The animal welfare, the aspect of animal welfare, we see that there is an act in 1907, and we see that has been certainly cruelty against animals has been addressed in those scenarios. We have had amendments, we have the Law Commission giving certain suggestions as well. Where do we stand right now? What is the principal legislature that we need to bear in mind when looking at animal cruelty?
Before going into that, Danidu, I would like to point out the current legislations that deals with animals in general that we have in our country. Now, there are a number of statutes with regard to that. Of course, as you quite rightly mentioned, cruelty to animals ordinance is one of the main statutes that deals with animal welfare. But then there are other acts, such as the Animals Act, the Fauna and Flora Act Protection Ordinance, Animal Diseases Act, the Butchers Ordinance, and the Dangerous Animals Ordinance. Now, these are all statutes that deals with animals in general. But we know today's topic is animal welfare. Some of these acts are, of course, protecting the rights of animals and speaks a lot about animal welfare and a lot of things concerning animal welfare. And provisions and regulations with regard to animal welfare are embedded in these statutes. Now, if I speak about the piece of legislation that specifically deals on animal welfare are the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance, Act number 22 of 1955, Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and Animals Act mainly deals with the agricultural aspect of things. So these three acts, mainly the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance and the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance, are the present pieces of legislation that deals with animal welfare, so to speak.
All right, I think that gives us a basic understanding of where we are as of now, and it's not as if it's an entire vacuum. But as you mentioned, there we have multiple areas, multiple occupations that are attached to how animals work and how people work with animals. The next step I want to take is let's take a breakdown there. Now, if we start with the cruelty to animals legislation, what are the basic provisions that are available? What are things that one should bear in mind when considering this? Or is there somewhere else that we should start, Mrs. Sanjith, pertaining to this discussion?
Yes. Now, the main statute, as you also quite correctly mentioned, is the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance. But I must say, at the very inception, that this is quite an outdated piece of legislation. This has not been amended for almost half a century now. It's quite outdated, and the final amendment is that number 22 of 1955, and of course it protects animals. It protects animals against cruelty, and Section 2, Section 3 clearly deals with cruel beating, ill treatment of animals, overdrive, ride, abuse, torture. All that is covered, but it's far behind the current standards, that the international standards that are required when it comes to protection of animals in the modern age. In the modern era, there is this act is virtually does not cover or come anywhere near the standards required in protecting of animals as required in the modern context. But basic protection is given to animals. There are penalties against people who unlawful cruel killing of animals. There are penal sanctions on that, and also it covers. But only thing is the penal sanctions themselves are not amended for a number of years. So fines and imprisonments are actually does not meet the standards required in the modern context. So this particular amendment statute is now being considered to be repealed. So that, of course, I believe we'll get into that topic later on in our discussion.
Yeah.
But for now, I can say that Section 2 of the present ordinance clearly states that cruel beating, ill treatment, overdrive, ride, abuse, torture, all of that are offences under the particular act. Then, and also when it comes to any person who unlawfully, in a cruel, inhumane manner, kills an animal, is an offence under the present law. So it has this particular statute only has around altogether 12 provisions, which is not adequate enough. So there are so many aspects that we need to look into in the modern context, which are not covered by this particular statute. That is why presently the Ministry of Agriculture has appointed a committee, and that committee has been working tirelessly, and they have done an exceptional job in bringing up a draft bill. I might not be able to go into the absolute context and details of that draft bill because it's still a confidential document being discussed. But however, I will assure that there is a very good piece of legislation meeting the highest standards required.
All right.
And apart from that,
continue.
Yes, and apart from that, in our country, we have legislation such as the Fauna and Flora Act, the ordinance, which covers animals' rights to a great extent. Especially, as you know, Sri Lanka is a country. We have wildlife sanctuaries. Now, within the wildlife sanctuaries, none of the animals living within the sanctuary cannot be touched. None of them can be subject to any sort of a harm, because the Fauna and Flora Act, Section 6, 7, 8, all of that covers it amply. Then thereafter, protection of elephants and buffaloes our special protection is given under this particular act. So, Danidu, absolutely, we must consider that Sri Lankan legislation as it is has given quite a significant place to animals. We have provisions in our law that can take people to justice if they cause harm to animals. But only thing is the main statute that deals with cruelty to animals or rather welfare of animals is quite outdated. It does not require them. It does not meet the modern standards required. So because of that, that has to be repealed, and that is in process right now. Other than that, we have the Animals Act, which deals with the agricultural aspect of it and slaughter of cattle and so on and so forth. So all of that is regulated, done methodically within the present context. But the cruelty to animals ordinance will be amended so that we might see that piece of legislation in very soon. I think it is at the last stages.
All right. Something I want to ask from you before we go into our break is this gazette notification on the people that drive elephants. Now, this was the most recent issue that sprung up, and I believe we'll have to touch on that a bit. Is that the general way we have been addressing this issue? Is it a gazette notification when it comes to situations? Because this issue pertaining to, maybe not pertaining to elephants that have been used for these kind of purposes, but the contact points between humans and elephants have been an issue for quite some time, and it has been a controversial subject also. How has this been addressed, Mrs. Sanjith? I need to just get a general take on it, because the most recent gazette notification was really strict on this measure, and it took some strict measures against how animals are being handled. Anything that you would like to add on that part?
Yeah, now speaking of this particular gazette notification and that subject on animals and subject on elephants, whether we are in a position to keep elephants in a domesticated environment and all of that is a very hot topic in the country right now. And in fact, there's a court case pending at the moment. So since it is a matter which is before the Supreme Court right now, I think we might not be able to comment on this subject to a grave extent. But I must say this. Now, the issue with regard to elephants and everything to do with elephants, as I mentioned earlier, are regulated by the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. Now, if you look at sections dealing with section 12, 13, 14, all of that covers the elephants that are living outside sanctuaries and the immediate vicinity of the sanctuaries. Now, when you say outside the sanctuaries and the immediate vicinity, that is, elephants are large mammals and they cannot be confined into a particular sanctuary without proper fencing. So fencing is there, but still they go and attack villagers, and a lot of things happen. And unfortunately, ends up in death of human life as well as the elephants. So, however, the present legislation with regard to the Fauna and Flora Law, especially section 12, 13, 14 of the said Act, gives adequate protection to these animals. Because even a shooting of an animal is considered to be taken as the last resort. After the director gives an order to that, which is the last resort if the animal cannot be controlled by any means. Section 20, 21, 22, all that covers that particular part. So that is the last resort that one can take, is the shooting and killing of an elephant. But that, before that, all steps has to be taken to ensure that the animal is restrained. True. But if the animal is so uncontrollable that is going to cause danger to human life or lives at large, then the director can make a decision on that aspect, which as the last resort. True. But other than that, elephants are well and truly protected under the present law. Only issue is with regard to these elephants which are used for cultural purposes and religious purposes and so on and so forth. That matter, of course, is presently being looked into by the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So,
A contentious
so I believe,
subject there.
since it's a matter before court,
Yeah.
it's best that we refrain from discussing that point. But I must say very clearly, elephants are absolutely protected under the present law.
Okay.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. I think
Among other animals,
yeah.
Fauna and Flora Act deals with especially there's an entire chapter that deals with elephant and buffaloes. So whenever they go out of the sanctuary, whenever they maybe attack a village or so on and so forth, every measure has to be taken according to the regulations provided by the Act
to protect these
restrain them.
True.
And also ensure that human life is not in danger. But
Sanjith, I want to interrupt you there because I want to touch this content again within our next segment on agricultural uses, because we really need to get a take on the Flora Fauna Act and how that coincides with the agricultural uses of animals and how people, the domestication aspect works. Before we go into that, let's take a very short break. You are with Law, Land and Liberty. Stay with us.
My name is Marisha Gunawadana and I'm a law graduate. My question is on animal agriculture in Sri Lanka. What are the legal provisions in place to ensure the welfare of the animals that are being used in this industry?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in discussion with Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake, and we are on the topic of animal rights, and we are talking about how animal welfare really works within Sri Lanka. Now, pertinent issue, an issue that most Sri Lankans are facing, is how the legislative framework in play when we deal with animals on a domestication level, in terms of agriculture. Now, multiple areas that I need to question Mrs. Sanjith on to get clarification. I want to start with authorities. Now, when it comes to any specific issue within the country, we see that certain authorities have been empowered to take charge of that matter. People are certainly clear about which authorities to address, make even a phone call and make a complaint, make their issues heard. Ms. Sanjith, when it comes to animal cruelty, as a suggestion to the layman, if they do see or witness an issue of animal cruelty, if that's questionable sort of treatment to animals, which authorities should they reach out to?
Now, if you think about animals in general, if somebody witnesses somebody inhumanely treating an animal or beating up an animal, something like that, immediately you must contact the local police and go and give a statement and lodge a complaint. Then the local police can act according to the provisions of the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance. But however, if it is some sort of a special animal or a wild animal of some sort, maybe amphibian of a special kind, different types of vertebrates, and that type of an animal or an elephant or something like that, of course they can complain to the wildlife conservation department and make the relevant complaints there. Then they will contact the relevant police department and initiate action. So these are the ways in which the public can ensure that animals are protected, and we must also encourage the public that at all times just to not to show a blind eye for this type of thing. The moment they witness that an animal has been inhumanely treated, either beaten up, because as we know, animals are living beings that cannot communicate.
True.
They are unable to communicate, they are unable to express their feelings, but animals too go through immense pain and suffering, and they like human beings do get depressed and they contribute to the economy to a great extent. All sides of species, especially in Sri Lanka, in a country like Sri Lanka, where our country is driven by tourism. Foreigners come from elsewhere, they look at our wildlife, they go to the wildlife sanctuaries, theme parks, and look at our animals, and we earn a lot of money out of that. We earn a lot of revenue out of it. So because of that, it is of utmost importance that we as citizens of this country, it's our duty, I must say, that everybody, every individual in this country has a duty to protect our animals and to make a complaint to the appropriate authorities when the need arises and when we witness such inhuman treatment being inflicted upon animals.
Ms. Sanjith, something I want to clarify here, because we are in the topic of the agricultural uses of animals and how animals really work with people. I want to ask you, as a sort of blanket question pertaining to the general restrictions, the general law that is present to domestication of animals. Is it specific to certain animals? Where do we find this law? Is it just the cruelty against animals ordinance that we had to address, or are there other things? Because I think you mentioned the Butchers Ordinance also, and things like the Flora Fauna Act, and there are certain restrictions put in play to protected species of animals. How does all of this come into play when it comes to agricultural and domestication aspect?
Now, the agricultural use of animals are mainly covered by the Animals Act done.
Okay.
Animals Act covers virtually most of the provisions pertaining to animals that are used for agricultural purposes. That is the Animals Act of Act number 29 of 1958, as amended by Act number 46 of 1988. So this particular act virtually gives restrictions on controlling and removal from elephant from one administrative district to another, regulating bordering of animals, identification of the ownership of the animal, regulation with regard to slaughter of animals, then also improving breeds of animals. All these things are regulated by this particular statute. Then slaughtering and removal of animals in that particular act, Section 2 to Section 3, somewhere there deals with that particular aspect. Then branding of cattle and also issuing vouchers pertaining to that particular coordinated brand. This is purely to identify the cattle and so that it will stay within that particular district and the administrative district. So any cattle which goes out of that administrative district can be easily identified, and the ownership can be traced easily. So that particular process and the regulations are all in this particular act. Then also it also deals with trespass of animals and castration and breeding of animals. There are separate chapters on this particular act. So when it comes to this act, as according to the interpretation section on the act, it mainly deals with cattle, pigs, and poultry. So it doesn't cover all the animals which are living under a domesticated setup, but mainly deals with cattle, pigs, and poultry. So those are the animals that are used for agricultural purposes. So agricultural purposes, has to be seriously regulated, because now slaughtering of animals, there's a separate act for that. So that particular act only deals with how to regulate slaughterhouses and so on and so forth, and what laws pertain to that. That is also quite a outdated piece of legislation, which might need repeal, but nevertheless that's there in place. But however, the Animals Act virtually covers all aspects pertaining to agricultural use of animals, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Mr. Sanjith, something I want to clarify on that, on certain things that you mentioned is now, how does this classification of an animal who can be used for an agricultural purpose or who is domesticated for another purpose made? Now, if an animal is found out in maybe the wild, in nature, what are the protective mechanisms in play for those animals? Or are there protective mechanisms in play? Is it the person that discovers a certain animal has some form of ownership over it, or should the legislature sort of make some form of steps forward in this identification process? Because I think something very important you mentioned was when it comes to the identification of people of animals such as cattle, there is the PHI or someone gets involved, and there's a certain tag that is put in a healthy sort of non-destructive manner, and that animal is protected to a certain extent. So is that form of identification or recognition present within the law, or is it just that if a person discovers an animal, that discovery, the person that makes that discovery sort of gains ownership?
Now it's like this, Danidu. With regard to cattle land as defined by the Animals Act, those animals are properly regulated. Now, Animals Act, Section 38 of the Animals Act clearly reads, animal means cattle, buffalo, which also includes sheep, goat, pig or poultry. So those animals are governed by this particular act. But the other animals are generally governed by the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance, which does not have any mechanism with regard to identification of ownership or anything with regard to that. Okay. So that is why we are bringing in new laws that this law has to be completely repealed. And the committee assigned to that particular subject has done an exceptional job in keeping in line with the international standards. So that law, when that law is enacted very shortly, once cabinet approves and it goes to parliament and passes the committee stage and so on and so forth, I believe we will have one of the best pieces of legislation protecting animals, probably one of the best in the world. Because it's up there with all the top countries right now, where animal laws are graded A grade countries. There are a few A grade countries such as UK, Switzerland, Austria. So we will also, our piece of legislation will also match their legislation to a great extent when this is enacted in Parliament, when it becomes law. But until such time, cattle is protected well and truly by the Animals Act. There's no doubt about that. Identification, branding, all that has to be done, and the government veterinary surgeons play a huge role with regard to that. They are properly regulated. There's entire procedure and regulation laid down as far as cattle, pigs, poultry are concerned, sheep are concerned. So, but with regard to animals in general, are not adequately protected by the outdated legislation that we have at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, I think that
it protects animals against cruel treatment, but it does not meet the standards that are required. In fact, the fine for a person who even kills an animal in an inhumane way is still 100 rupees. Maximum fine is 200 rupees. I mean, I don't think it's acceptable by any measure in the modern context.
Yeah. Clearly certain areas that we need to build on. I think a lot of things that we can talk about in the last segment also. As I listened to you, Mrs. Sanjith, a lot of sort of questions got ticked out because a lot of clarifications were made pertaining to how the use of animals in agriculture and the general domestication is differentiated. So we'll continue this discussion, but before that, let's go meet Suzanne Shenali, who will give us the current legal happenings within this specific week, within the legal field within this country. Here's Suzanne Shenali with Law in the Land.
Thank you, Danidu. Let's now take a look as to how the law has worked in our land. The Chief Justice appointed a special trial at bar at the Colombo High Court to hear the indictments comprising charges against 25 accused in connection with the Easter Sunday terror attack that took place on April 21st in 2019. Colombo High Court Judge Damit Peravatta was being appointed as the presiding judge of the panel, while High Court Judges Amal Ranaraja and Navaratna Marasinghe have been appointed as the other members of the judge panel. The finance bill, which was debated in the parliament, was being passed with amendments by the majority vote. The finance bill enables individuals to voluntarily disclose undisclosed taxable supplies, income and assets, which are required to be publicized under some laws. In addition, it allows the imposition of taxes and taxable income and assets. Further, the bill will enable granting tax amenities and indemnification of individuals who voluntarily disclose taxable supplies, income or assets against liability from investigation, prosecution and penalties under specified laws. The Court of Appeal maintained that the current pandemic situation is common to all prisoners and that it cannot be treated as an exceptional circumstance to grant bail. The court made the observation when it took up a revision application by the suspect engaged in importing goods and under whose name a container with a consignment of about 68 kilograms of heroin was found. The suspect had sought bail citing an illness and the COVID-19 situation. That was a look at the major events of how the law has worked in our land. We will now go into a short commercial break. Vanidul will be back after the break.
I'm a founder of Baobab Animal Welfare Organization. My question is about international protective mechanism. What are the international mechanisms available for animal rights?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in discussion with Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake. He's a convener consultant for the Criminal Law Reform Subcommittee at the Ministry of Justice. We have covered two segments pertaining to animal welfare and animal rights and how animals function in the agricultural field within this country. A lot of questions are answered. Our next segment basically is going to be on how the international community and Sri Lanka functions when it comes to animal rights and animal welfare in general. Now, one pertinent question that will come up is what exactly are the international mechanisms that we are part of or that we are governed by? This question, Ms. Sanjith, stems from the fact that a lot of critique had been raised in the past about how constitutions, maybe even the Indian constitution at one point had sort of protected animals there within their supreme legislation also. And I want to ask you, maybe within our last segment at least, whether we are also heading in that direction. But fundamentally, what are the international mechanisms that we are part of in terms of carrying this animal rights forward?
Now, Danidu, at present, as we mentioned earlier, as you also quite correctly mentioned, that we have a legislation for animal welfare. The present legislation that we already have is quite outdated and it needs repeal, and which is being considered and is at the final stages. I must say the international body that looks into the standards of animal welfare is the well-known international organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, commonly known as OIE. Now, they set standards on several criteria, that is transportation, slaughter, use of animals for research, control of dog population, the stray dog population, then other productivity and other production systems and so on and so forth. There are a number of them. So based on those categories, they also constantly change their policies. They decide what type of vertebrate and what type of animals are to be considered endangered, what type of standards that needs to be followed. Then they closely work with veterinary surgeons, associations all around the world, and upgrade their systems and standards. Then use of animals in research is another area that they are concerned about. How are we to make the use of an animal in a particular research the last resort is what they're looking into at present. Because if there is other alternatives that we can use in research, when it comes to research, we must always go for those avenues instead of endangering the life of an animal. But if the use of an animal for a particular research is for the greater good, which will contribute to saving a lot of lives, then surely a law should permit that type of research. So then again, high standards are set in the world at the moment pertaining to transport of animals, how they are transported, whether proper ventilation has been provided when transported. When large animals are transported, whether the proper standards are met and what are the standards. All that is been looked into, and periodically they publish papers the laws, the countries who are signatories to that virtually go by those particular standards. But unfortunately, our legislation is a outdated piece of legislation and does not come anywhere near the present standards required internationally. But I must assure that the bill that is to be drafted has looked into all these aspects. There are chapters divided for the topics that I just mentioned to you all. There are chapters divided for those particular topics, which has gone into great detail in ensuring that all animals are protected and all aspects of the required standards are met. Now, countries which are in the top of this particular, with regard in the top, actually, what they say is there is a rating system. So there's A-rated. There are a few A-rated companies, such as UK has A rating, Austria has A rating, Switzerland and New Zealand has A rating. So our goal and our target should be to obtain an A rating when it comes to protection of animals. Given the fact that our Sri Lankan economy relies on the animals that lives in this land, being a state which obtains a massive revenue from tourism, and which has a number of wildlife sanctuaries, as I mentioned earlier. So we must ensure that we reach these standards so that our animal population is protected. So now, international standards when it comes to protecting of animals, especially when it comes to slaughtering, I must mention. There are according to certain maybe religious beliefs and so on and so forth, insanguination is how slaughtering is done. But stunning an animal or making an animal unconscious before insanguinating them, I think is a very humane manner when it comes to slaughtering. So that type of standard is adopted in a lot of countries, such as Switzerland, such as England, and Austria. So those are those. Now when it comes to slaughtering of animals for food, it's a very controversial topic because slaughtering of animals have to be done for that particular purpose. But then, what is the best way that we can do it? Is the question. Are we going to slaughter an animal in an inhumane manner, causing severe pain to that particular animal? Now, those practices have been happening in our country, unfortunately. Especially when it comes to there are so much of videos that have been circulating on social media. Some things which are unbearable to watch. How they slaughter pigs. So these type of things are not accepted in the modern era. So those are the issues that we are faced with, and the new legislation will surely cover those aspects well and truly, and new methods of slaughtering are being discussed, and those things will be made law with the new piece of legislation. And not only that, when it comes to protecting animals such as pets, how pet shops are to be run, how breeding of dogs and how pets. These are aspects that we need to go into detail, because proper standards are not met, because we don't have a piece of legislation at the moment to regulate, unfortunately. That is why it is a dire need that it's very urgent that we pass this piece of legislation, expedite the process and get this done as soon as possible. And I'm sure the committee appointed for that is dedicated to that end. And also our committee consists of the Criminal Law Reform Subcommittee consists of several eminent counsels, and they are also very much eager and eagerly waiting to see this law passed in Parliament. And also we as a committee has proposed certain amendments. In the interim, we proposed a short amendment to the Animal Cruelty Ordinance just to get the fines and the sentences increased. But however, since the present bill, which is a very comprehensive bill, is at the last stages, I see no point in another interim amendment at the moment.
Okay.
But however, we made an amendment to the dangerous animals. We have submitted an amendment to the Dangerous Animals Ordinance. Section 8. Section 8 of the Dangerous Animals Ordinance speaks of destruction of a dangerous animal. So we amended that particular provision. If I may read out that particular amendment that we have proposed so far, the destruction of an animal shall only be carried out in a humane manner, with no pain or suffering caused to the animal, and shall be only performed by a registered veterinary professional. Okay. So that is euthanization of an animal is what we are speaking of. It has to be done without causing the least amount of pain. You must not let the animal suffer. So these are the standards that the world is looking into. Surely a dangerous animals, which is dangerous to humans or any other species, will have to be euthanized. And this provision is quite right. Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Ms. Sanjith, I want to ask you a small clarification on that point. Now, something that is really governed by international standards, I think you mentioned this when we spoke about the Flora-Fauna Act and how that is protecting certain protected species, and there we find these dangerous species also available. How exactly, if you could point at certain legislation or certain acts or certain sections that really talk about these animals that are in these sort of protected areas, these animals that should be protected given that they're endangered or that they're close to be extinct or they're extinct in the wild, or maybe these issues of international concern, because these animals might be endemic just to Sri Lanka, and whether there are restrictions in play about how those animals should be protected. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, international now, like I mentioned, the World Organization for Animal Health sets the standards for international law with regard to animals. Other countries, the signatory countries to that, they follow that, and they keep on amending their laws accordingly. Now, one of the key features that we are trying to bring about is in our new animal welfare bill, there is an entire chapter dedicated to establishment of an animal welfare advisory committee.
All right.
So this particular committee will look into the modern standards that are practiced internationally and advise the minister accordingly. So the committee members can look into the present standards. That's part of their statutory obligation. Sure. So they have to adhere to that. They must look at it. They must follow once the laws changes internationally, accordingly propose changes that need to be done. Okay. So, for example, if elephants becomes endangered to a great extent, then strict measures have to be taken to protect the elephants. True. Maybe sections such as section 20, 22, 29 of the Fauna and Flora Act will have to be amended as well, because killing of an elephant, even if it causes danger to certain lives, will have to be revisited in the light of things like that. So that is why there is a separate establishment of an animal welfare advisory committee.
Mr. Sanjith, I think you gave a really good segue. Yeah, you gave a really good segue to our last segment, which is about the animal welfare bill. I need to give you some time to really elaborate on what we can expect as a general populace, because this has been in the discussion platform for quite some time. Let's take a very short break. We're in discussion with Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake. Stay with us on Law, Land and Liberty.
Animal welfare activist and environmentalist. To my knowledge, the animal welfare bill that has been in the making is now almost ready to be gazetted. Can you explain what provisions and protection it will give our street and community animals once it is legalized?
Welcome to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in our last segment. We are in conversation with Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake. He's the convener consultant for the Criminal Law Reform Subcommittee in the Ministry of Justice. Mr. Sanjith, the last segment, as we announced previously, is going to focus on the Animal Welfare Bill. Now, a lot of people, granted, would be frustrated with the fact that the Animal Welfare Bill took too long, and there has been a lot of activism, a lot of uproar pertaining to the Animal Welfare Bill taking ground, having that fleshed out and not just being a skeletal sort of like draft. You mentioned quite a few times about how this bill is going to cater to the needs and cater to certain wants that do generally update the law pertaining to animal welfare. How do you see the Animal Welfare Bill coming out? How do you see that it will, what key areas do you think it will focus on? What key areas should it focus on based on the current vacuums that exist?
Now, Danidu, the Animal Welfare Bill is not a bill that is being drafted by the Ministry of Justice. It is not a bill which is done by our committee. It is a bill that has been done by the Agricultural Ministry, and Agricultural Ministry has appointed a committee to that. And that committee has been looking into this particular law for, I believe, for quite some time, and now they have come up with a draft bill, and which is in process. Now, if I am to comment about the work that has been done and put into this particular piece of legislation that is to be come into Parliament, I must say they have done a absolutely marvelous job. They have touched all segments, all standards that are internationally required with regard to pertaining to animal welfare. So it's quite a detailed bill, not like a 13-section legislation like what we have. They have gone into several chapters and done a detailed job in ensuring that animals are well and truly protected according to the present international standards. I must assure and I must congratulate them for their effort. I must make this an opportunity to do that, because I think a lot of hard work has gone into that. And since the matter is now at its last stage, I told you earlier that our committee proposed a temporary amendment, a transitional amendment, just to get the fines increased. But since this matter is at its last stage, the cabinet has decided to expedite that process and ensure that the Animals Welfare Bill will become law in the very near future. So, if I may briefly explain, Animals Welfare Bill, like I mentioned earlier, the international organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, looks at matters like transportation, slaughter, use of animals in research, and also the cruelty to animals. Those are the main topics that the World Organization for Animal Health looks at. Now, the law that is to be passed in the future will surely address all the issues pertaining to that, and the legislation will cover most aspects of it. For example, if you think about most likely the first part of the legislation will deal with cruelty to animals, and it will cover all aspects of it, including the provisions that we currently have, and it will go beyond that. It will go beyond that, making special provisions and special penal sanctions for inhumane treatment of animals, inhumane treatment of pregnant animals, killing of pregnant animals. It will be absolutely detailed, Danidu, with regard to those facts. And abandonment of animals, leaving an animal to stray on a road and abandoning an animal, abandoning an injured animal, all those, and castration and sterilization by non-professionals, which causes severe pain and discomfort to animals. All that minor details will be looked into by this piece of legislation. Then thereafter, there will be an entire segment on transportation of animals. Transportation of maybe pets, maybe cattle, maybe anything. Proper standards have to be implemented. in transportation. So entire chapter will be dedicated purely for transportation of animals. Then there will be use of animals for experiments and for technological purposes. So this is the topic that I indicated earlier. As far as there are other alternatives, always using animals for research in laboratories should be minimized if there is alternatives. But in the event that there is no alternative and the research outweighs the life, in the sense of research is intended to saving a lot of lives, then law should permit facilitating that type of research. So, so all those aspects are looked into, and then there will be a whole chapter based on regulating the sale of animals as pets. So, the International Organization for Animal Health sets out standards, how these pet shops are to be maintained. What are the standards? Ventilation. All these aspects have to be looked at. You can't have a pet shop without proper standards.
Exactly.
You can't have a number of animals caged up in a manner that will cause danger to that particular animal's life, and all those things be regularized, and laws will be placed with the present regulation.
Mr. Sanjith, since we are running out of time, I want to ask a final question. Since you mentioned that the welfare bill is within the draft stages, I know for a fact that a number of entities who have joined us also within this program have really raised concerns or raised areas of law that need to be improved or evolved. Is it still possible to make these suggestions? If so, which authorities should they reach out to in terms of amending this legislation? Is that a possible mechanism?
Like I mentioned earlier, this particular area is handled by the Ministry of Agriculture.
Ministry of Agriculture. Okay.
So, and there's a committee, a separate committee, not our committee, not the committee that I am sitting.
Yeah.
There's a separate committee looking into this matter, and they have drafted, as far as I know, they have drafted a very good piece of legislation, and now that has come. The legal drafts department has drafted it, and it's been discussed. So we are going to discuss this matter in our committee as well at a later stage, very soon actually. And we will also give our observations and concerns with regard to if there is any necessary changes that needs to be done to this particular draft bill. And after discussing with the members of our committee, and then from our end as well, we can look into expediting this matter. Then the next stage will be cabinet approval. And once cabinet approves all the provisions, then the matter can proceed.
Right. Ms. Sanjith Senanayake, I think a lot of areas that we really covered today pertaining to this subject, a pertinent subject, a subject that has been within the discussion platforms within society for quite some time. I want to thank you for shedding light on a number of key areas. We are looking forward for this piece of legislation to come into play, given the fact that we are now contesting on a global platform and the world eyes on us pertaining to how we develop our laws. And I think you really gave us proper context to it. Attorney-At-Law Sanjith Senanayake, the convener consultant for the Criminal Law Reform Subcommittee in the Ministry of Justice. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
Thanks, Lord. It's been a pleasure being a part of the program.
All right. The discussion on the importance of protecting and addressing the needs of animals has come up quite consistently. As a law student, I can personally attribute to the fact that any student who has studied jurisprudence has come across Immanuel Kant. He is considered to be a philosopher for a wide array of contributions, primarily in the field of moral reasoning. He once stated that he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. We can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. That is all from us here at Law, Land and Liberty. Join us again next week as we bring to you another contemporary legal topic. I'm Danny Ditana myself. Have a great night.